Welcome to the We Are Peru podcast, a podcast highlighting topics related to the Peru Central School District and greater Peru community.
Hello, my name is Scott Storms. I'm the Interim Superintendent at Peru Central School. We're here today to talk a little bit about Prom and what kind of events we have planned for Prom and thereafter Prom. And we're hoping that we can have a good discussion today about that. So today with us we have Deputy Mendoza, who is our district's resource officer. We have Deputy Russell Haag from the Clinton County Stop DWI. And we have our principal, Matt Berry, and the associate principal, Joha Battin here. We're going to have a good conversation about that.
Well, as a principal of Peru High School, I'd like to thank the Clinton County Stop DWI program and Deputy Haag and Deputy Mendoza for their involvement in coming here today. And we have our associate principal, Mr. Joha Battin, who has had a lot of experience in this, and myself having experience being not only the principal, but also class advisors and student council's advisors in the past. And this time of year is great because our students, especially, I won't call it in the wake of COVID quite yet, but in hopefully the calming of COVID and having more opportunities for students to have gatherings and get-togethers, it's a great thing to see our students who want to have this happen. They're asking questions. Can I have my guests? Are we going to hold this event? And it's really, really nice to have those conversations again. However, the concerned principal and me, and I think the officers will concur, and Mr. Battin, we always worry about decision making when it comes to these events and what surrounds those events. And I think we'd be naive to say that decision making is always crystal clear when we are a teenager. At least it wasn't for me, from my experience, admittedly so. So with that being said, would anybody like to weigh in on the our upcoming events, and we'll get a little bit more specific throughout the conversation as to what exactly is coming. But other perspectives maybe from law enforcement about this time of year, proms, and your experiences possibly, and any insight you may have.
Well, first and foremost, this is Deputy Mendoza speaking. I know I'm speaking on behalf of myself, and more than likely on behalf of everyone here seated at this table. Our goal today isn't to try and scare or frighten the student body or their parents. My main goal in law enforcement, and Mr. Berry and Mr. Battin's goal, is always to educate. And I think that's something that we really want to try and drive home today, is that we're just trying to educate the youth and any parents listening about some of the statistics and some of our experiences in law enforcement and here as administrators.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Deputy, that our push with this is to start this early. Our first senior prom, it's called, we don't normally hold a senior prom at Peru, but we are because they, very prudently, I will say, the student body elected last year to postpone their prom and hold it this year, and it will be happening on April 9th. And they are having it at PEX in Altona. And that's a different experience for us, too, at Peru. And I say that we want to get to the educational piece early and kind of have this package for parents and students, for that matter, as we're going to do this podcast. We are going to have a parent night, which is going to be both virtual and live, with a date to be announced, so we can look for that in late March. We're going to do a Project Prom, sort of a smaller version. Normally we would have the staged car accident out in front of our school, but we're going to do a smaller version in our auditorium. So I appreciate Deputy Mendoza putting that in that framework of this is an educational piece, and this is not to be a fear campaign at all. We want to be partners and facilitate good decision making amongst our student body this time of year.
I'm going to jump in. This is Joha Battin, the associate principal. I think, ultimately there's a lot of planning that goes into prom. And all that planning is done so that everybody can have a really good time. And I really see this as part of that planning and part of what's necessary for everybody to be able to have a good time, to talk about what is the good parts of prom, and then some of the things to be cautious of, to not get into, so that something bad doesn't happen, which can take what was a really good time and turn it into something that brings a lot of sadness to a community.
Absolutely. We talk about that a lot with the education part, and the ripple effect that causes, not only for the student that night, but for all families involved, and how it continues on. So, because if a bad decision is made, someone's going to deal with that, whether it's the person who made the bad decision or the person who was the victim of the bad decision, and their families continue on. And in this time of year, not only with prom, but I can speak on Stop DWI's behalf. Along with this time of year, for us, we're extremely busy because you have prom, then we have graduation right after it, and then just end of the school year. And for us, that's a major part of the framework for us to try to speak to kids about drinking, driving, impaired driving, and just the education part of being there at the end of the year, being there to support your friends at prom, and being able to continue on to go to college and stuff like that. So.
You brought up an interesting point, and I guess we'll go there in the conversation a bit. We had these conversations with both deputies and Mr. Battin, Mr. Storms for that matter. You had mentioned drinking and driving statistics, or excuse me, drinking and driving amongst teens, but also you mentioned impaired driving in general. Would you be able to speak to that? What your might be possible trends, some differences because we hear Stop DWI, there's way more to the picture than that.
Oh, absolutely. So just to give it a little background, Stop DWI was enacted back in 1981, and it's written into vehicle and traffic law, and it stands for Special Traffic Options Program. And initially, it started because of the laxed or lack thereof laws to deal with drinking and driving. And as we've progressed since 1981, more drugs have been introduced into our culture and our society, and now it's a combination of both drinking, it's with the drugs, or just drugs in general, because we all know this, the accessibility of these drugs, household drugs, whether it's over-the-counter prescription medication, narcotics, marijuana just became legalized. It's the access to these types of things that is bringing up the impaired driving, and that's why we kind of, I don't want to say we're switching our motto to just go from drinking and driving, but it's more of an impaired driving situation now. Because of the accessibility of these things and the amount of drugs that are out there, we can't avoid that. It has to be spoken about, it has to be dealt with, and we have to educate on those as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's, no matter what it is, we know it's bad for you as a human. It's bad for many reasons, addiction and health and those sorts of things. And I think it's important that we as a group are brave enough to have these conversations. And with that being said, I would say no matter what, somebody decides that particular day to put in their body, operating any sort of machinery or motor vehicle is not a good decision. And that's what we're trying to get at.
Absolutely.
And I mean, just to speak further on some of those points, the teen driving statistics from back in 2019, according to the CDC's website, I know there's some more up-to-date studies that came out late last year. However, I think it's probably more important to hit on the stats from 2019 as the stats from 2020, 21, and the beginning part of this year will be skewed due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, back in 2019, almost 2,400 teens in the United States aged 13 to 19 were killed, and about 258,000 of those were treated in emergency departments for injuries suffered in motor vehicle crashes. It means that every day about 7 teens died due to motor vehicle crashes, and hundreds more were injured. In addition, motor vehicle crash deaths among teens 15 and 19 years of age result in about $4.8 billion in medical and work loss costs for crashes that occurred in 2018. The risk of motor vehicle crashes is higher among teens, age 16 and 19, than among any other age group. In fact, per mile driven, teen drivers in this age group are nearly 3 times as likely as drivers age 20 or older to be in a fatal crash. Teens who are especially at high risk for motor vehicle crashes are males. In 2019, The motor vehicle death rate for male drivers aged 16 to 19 was over 2 times higher than the death rate for female drivers of the same age. We like to highlight this point because as we know, this is the age that all of you listening are at, or kind of in the realm of, and you've got prom in another month, and then the month after that for the juniors. So teens driving with teen or young adult passengers, the presence of teen or young adult passengers increases the crash risk of unsupervised teen drivers. This risk increases with each additional teen or young adult passenger. That's something I've spoken with a lot of you juniors and seniors about, is the distracted driving. In addition to drug and alcohol impaired driving, the distracted driving is a huge contributor to injuries and death, and tickets issued by us here in law enforcement.
I think that's really important to highlight, Officer Mendoza, because this first prom is going to be a 25 to 35-minute drive. And if things, I'm 43, not too old and not too out of touch, got a lot of gray hair, but still get it kind of a little bit. We wanted to ride with our friends. And I think that it's really important to highlight, the more people you put in the vehicle, the statistics increase significantly as for risk. Does that mean, nobody should ride together? No, I just think that families need to have conversations with their student drivers about, and in particular, again, we haven't done an off the campus prom in a long time. In particular, this drive is far. It's a road that is dangerous, and I'm sure that you've had your experiences out there, unfortunately, and I think that it's just really important that families continue to have conversations about what this means with their students, and that there will be driving. I will say, actually, I'll turn to Mr. Battin, because he was kind of instrumental in putting the transportation piece together, and I'll turn to him to kind of talk about what our plan is here at the school to provide safe transportation.
Yeah, sure. And before I do that, I just want to say, I think that this conversation about just the dangers of driving for teens in general is really poignant, because, a lot of the kids who are driving to prom have been driving for between one day, in some cases, I'm sure, and a year, and driving is inherently dangerous. And I think that a lot of times we talk to kids about, impaired driving, drunk driving, and they think to themselves, well, I'm not going to drink and I'm not going to do drugs, and so I don't have to worry about it, I'll be safe. And the reality is that just driving can be dangerous. Prom is really exciting, and prom and the excitement of prom and the other passengers in your car can be a distraction. And so I think that part of the conversation is really valid and poignant to just remind everybody, caution is really important. It's not just about not doing drugs and not drinking.
Absolutely.
Good point.
On the subject of transportation, the district is going to provide transportation to the prom in Altona. There will be school buses that will be available to pick students up here at the school, and then we'll be able to return them back here to the school after the prom. So either a parent would be able to drop the students off and then pick them up after the prom, or alternatively, if students wanted to, instead of having the longer commute from their home to Altona, they would be able to park here at the school and then just drive within our district.
Yeah, that was one of the, again, another one of the layers that we put in place there. I would imagine with the busyness of the day, there's going to be a lot of other alternative transportation plans for that particular event. Our junior class will be having their actual prom, the first actual on-time event we've had here in 2 years, at the Rustic Pines facility right here in Peru. Not as far of a drive, but definitely something I think I'd like to piggyback on Mr. Battin's point. It's exciting. We haven't done it in a while. I think we just need to remind families and students to be mindful and have the conversations about operating 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 plus pounds and what that really means.
And one of the things that I always try and hit on, especially speaking to the student population, is to have conversations amongst each other and check one another. If you're in a vehicle and you're driving to prom and you notice that who's ever driving is, obviously excited and, they could be driving well above the speed limit or just not being safe, call them out on it. Checking one another is going to lead to everyone's safety, and ultimately that's what we all care about here at the school and from a law enforcement perspective.
Yeah, we all care about what our friends think. Absolutely. So even if you said put them in check, tell them, I want to be here tomorrow, so let's not do that. Mm-hmm. And you were talking about the inexperience of the drivers from 1 day to 1 year, but it's sometimes it's not just those drivers. It could be the most experienced driver on the road who distracted and is now crossed into your lane, the inexperienced operator. So it has a wide range, whether it's impaired driving, distracted driving, drowsy driving, which is a subject we speak a lot about. It can affect all ages, all experiences. So we all need that person, whether it's high school or college friends or colleagues, to keep each other in check. That's a great point, Zach.
I think it's an important point that you made. Calling somebody out, it's not easy. It's hard, but at the same time, your families love you or love your kids. We want you here at our school. We want you to be a part of our community, and it's worth it. It's worth challenging those bad decisions. And at the end of the day, we all know, it's not really a debate, but it's more of a, how do you handle these teen decision, really important teen decisions of experimentation, drugs, alcohol, whatever you want to call it. How do you handle these conversations? I mean, even now as I sit here, I'm trying to be delicate with it. But at the same time, your teenager's life is way more important than a consequence or a punishment, so to speak. And I say that with the, coupling with what you just said. It may not be the teen driver who makes the mistake, but the awareness piece in a car full of 4 teenagers, if the driver's focused on the road, they may be able to make the right decision to avoid the collision or whatever it may be that's not their fault.
Absolutely.
And I would try to segue maybe to, would you as law enforcement be able to talk maybe a little bit about the laws that are in place, like New York zero tolerance law and any other laws that you think people should be aware of as we go through this, to talk about the legal piece as well?
Yeah, I mean, when speaking about New York's zero tolerance, it's just that, zero tolerance. Drinking age is 21 in the state of New York. If you're operating a motor vehicle under the age of 21 and you're impaired from a level of .02 and above, it's an administrative action that's conducted through the Department of Motor Vehicles. The first offense is right around a $150 fine with a 6-month revocation of your license. So even one drink could put you at that 0.2 and put you in that realm of having your license suspended for 6 months. Your second offense, if you do it twice under the age of 21, your license is automatically revoked. And it's for 6 months, or correction, I believe it's 1 year or until the age of 21. So if you're 17 and you get that second offense, your license is revoked. That means you have to go through the whole process again to get your license back, and it's gone to 21. So I really think the students, anyone under 21, need to know these things, that it's something that New York does not slide on. It is very, very serious actions if you do that, because you're putting your life in danger and you're putting everyone else's lives in danger, on top of the inexperience of your ability to drive. Now you're impaired with any level.
Just to clarify some points there, it's .02 to .05. If you, as someone under the age of 21, is found to be in that realm, you'll face that administrative law judge. Anything above a .06, we can charge you with DWI or DWI. You can still
be criminal offense.
Yes, you can still be charged with the criminal offense if the arresting officer, elects to do that.
Absolutely. Yep, you're correct.
Thank you for that. I think it's one of the things that are out there that we may not always have an opportunity to speak with our kids about, and that's why we're doing this here today.
You know, I'm going to bring up one of my favorite topics, which is vaping, because, you know, as many members of our community know, vaping is something that is really widely spread in our adolescents. And I have witnessed myself kids who have, as a result of vaping, become ill or passed out even. And, you know, we haven't talked about vaping. We've talked about, you know, illegal drugs. I think our topic has pretty much been about illegal drugs and alcohol. But I think that the possibility of vaping and having a bad experience as a result of that and driving is also something that's worth a conversation. In that, you know, people are going to be doing things together for the first time in a really long time, and that's oftentimes when kids are introduced to things like vaping for the first time.
You mentioned the excitement in the moment,
Right.
And the decision making can be impaired by the excitement alone without
Sure.
adding anything into the mix. That shouldn't be in your body.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking purely on the vaping, obviously nicotine addiction is high. I don't think most of us know this, but until the age of 25, our brains aren't fully formed yet. So ingesting nicotine at a young age essentially rewires your brain. It leads to an increased sensitivity to addictive behaviors and addictive substances. Your synapses in your brain aren't wired correctly anymore after that point. And, you know, taking something from someone else and not knowing what's inside of it, again, I know we're speaking purely about the e-cigarettes and nicotine. However, it's fairly simple to introduce a foreign substance into any one of the, commonly used vaping devices. And that could range from anything from, simple THC, and then, you could have a possible THC overdose just because, the amount of concentrated cannabis is high and your tolerance isn't up there yet, to something even potentially life-threatening like fentanyl being introduced into the vaping device, and then, that never leads to a pretty outcome.
I think that's a really scary piece because we hear about it, and sometimes we think, North Country, we're small, we don't have these issues, but unfortunately, I think we're hearing about them more and more.
Yes, I like to think that we live in a small protective bubble. However, my experience working nights for the past 6 years has led me to not believe that. The prevalence of drugs in our community is pretty high. And I'm not saying just, simple light drugs, in air quotations of, marijuana and over-the-counter pills. There's some heavy stuff out there on the streets right now, and unfortunately, it's being introduced to our kids at a young age.
And is it safe to say or correct to say it's fairly easy to get?
Yes.
Absolutely.
It's pretty simple to get.
Absolutely. And that's why I talked earlier, the accessibility of some of this stuff, along with the vapes, implicit of the illegal drugs, just the nicotine. It's so easy for them to get now, and that's what we were talking prior to this, on how you can go to a friend's house, their parents have something, or you might have something at the medicine cabinet. You can get the prescription drugs. I know we spoke a little about that. Those are legal, but they're only legal for the prescribed member who's taking them. They're illegal for you to take somebody else's medications or steal those. So it is a legal drug per se because it's a prescription, but it does have that level of impairment, and it's easily accessible to anybody and everybody. I mean, we talk about that a lot with stop and traffic safety. One thing you were talking about earlier, Zach, and I don't think you mentioned, and I'm not a medical expert by any means, but with the vaping, there's a lot of implications with the lungs. We were looking that up. And
Popcorn lung.
that's right. That's
What
what it
it's
was.
commonly referred to as. I believe that's just the due to some of the substances and additives inside the vaping device. There's propylene glycol, vitamin E acetate, and some other substances, all of which were not meant to be inhaled. They were meant to be ingested. So when we're inhaling these things, it's affecting our lungs, creating popcorn lung, which leads to a huge decrease in your body's ability to filter the oxygen coming in and expelling it in CO2. A lot of that gets trapped in there. The rates of seizures, heart attacks, strokes at young ages has been on a steady increase due to this.
And I brought that up because a lot of the kids that I know I've spoken to, they talk about vaping as the effective, well, it's so much safer than smoking a cigarette. I'm not putting all that smoke in my lungs. I'm not putting all that bad stuff that's in the tobacco, and it's not safer.
I talk to kids about that, and I remind them that's oil that you're vaping.
Yes.
And if you want to know what vaporized oil is like once it gets inside your lungs, go home and in the hood over your stove where you cook, take that little screen off and feel that hard sticky stuff. That's vaporized oil. Nobody sprayed the oil up there.
Yeah.
It
This is a great
vaporized out of
analogy.
the frying pan.
That's a great comparison.
And that's what it looks like. It's just in your lungs. Yeah.
And if there's anyone listening to this who is struggling with vaping or nicotine addiction, I would highly encourage you to go to teen.smokefree.gov. On that website, there's a plethora of information that's available to you, inclusive of a text message group or an app that you can download in which someone will communicate with you and try and encourage appropriate decision-making and behaviors that could lead to you, helping you along your path to quitting vaping and whatever else you may or may not be ingesting.
That's a really good point, and I think, again, to highlight this, we're here with law enforcement and the associate principal and the principal, and I think a lot of people would see us and be like, oh, there's the rule enforcers, and I think I really want to be strong with the message of this podcast and what we're trying to create with the partnership with our SRO and Clinton County Stop DWI is we want to educate and empower our students to make good decisions. And I think at the end of the day, we're having a conversation about driving, of course. This impairs driving. People know that. There's a reason since 1981, if you talk to some old timers about the stories of the 60s and 70s, I think they tell you it was a much different culture than it is now when it comes to stopping impaired driving. But we have the driving piece, the safety piece. I appreciate Officer Mendoza bringing into the game the health piece of it and the connection. And again, the focus on decision making, and I want to piggyback on what Officer Mendoza said about help. I think a lot of times people are probably hesitant to go to the SRO or the principal or the associate principal about help. And let's put a pretty distinct line on this. These things are not allowed in school. If you bring them to school, there will be consequences. Generally, those consequences are pretty stiff. However, we are here to help. So if you're in a situation where you do feel like you would need some help as a student, we have those resources, and I think that's important that we're very clear about understanding the difference between the need for a punitive measure, such as bringing something to school that doesn't belong, and that's really whether you're an adult or a student at our school, or you're in a situation where you don't know what to do, and we have those resources here as well.
I think that's a great point, Mr. Berry, and I just want to say, the ultimate goal absolutely is to help kids make good decisions, and if they have made a bad decision, to help them make better decisions in the future. And sometimes that is through some sort of counseling or treatment. The goal is definitely not to catch people doing things and then give them a consequence. We actually rewrote our student code of conduct regarding using vapes in school because of that, because we saw that there are kids who are addicted and they don't want to be addicted, but they've, I guess, lived in the shadows of addiction, So we actually rewrote the student code of conduct so that we could provide help to those kids that wanted the help to stop using the e-cig rather than just say, well, you caught me, but what's my punishment? And we'll see if you can catch me again.
Important point about the decision-making process, because that one decision that you make can lead to more and more issues that you'll have to deal with, such as addiction. It could be one decision that you make. Generally, oftentimes it is. I hate to say it, it could be a car accident.
The ripple effect.
the ripple effect of making those things. Yeah, absolutely. However, again, we're here to help, and I think it's important to also know that parents, if you do have a new teen driver, we are fortunate. We have an SRO. He can have talks and has had talks with students and regularly has talks with students about teen driving and safety. In fact, we're before we get into, and this is a daily thing. I also want to kind of circle back to this being a prom conversation, but it's a daily thing where our teen drivers are faced with the decision-making process on a daily basis. So we want to continue to have the conversations. I want to be very clear, as a school in partnership with law enforcement, we're not afraid to have the conversations. I'd be naive to say that, does a bad decision come with some consequences sometimes? Absolutely, but it doesn't end there for us. It's a continued conversation. And I worked with Officer Mendoza enough and Officer Haag enough to know that we don't demonize people who make a bad decision, but we want to continue to help them through the process.
I want to say about consequences that a lot of times people don't realize that the reason that we have consequences for students and even adults in the law enforcement world are that we're trying to avoid big consequences. The consequence of you did something, you drove in a way that was unsafe in the student parking lot, and so there's a few days you can't drive your car. That's so that you don't end up with the consequence of living with running somebody over, or crashing your car or something like that. And I think that's ultimately this conversation is try to avoid any consequences, but especially, big consequences that are lifelong consequences.
It's just understanding that each and every single one of us has to take accountability for our actions. And sometimes in order to get us to that point where we can take accountability, we need to get checked either by fellow student, law enforcement, school administrators. And it's never anything out of spite or anger or anything like that. Again, like Mr. Battin said, it's accountability. We want you guys to be safe and prevent something more tragic from happening further on down the road.
Yeah, the goal of the events is to have a good time. And honestly, the goal of our school is to provide a place where students can get their education. And we pride ourselves at our school here to have many pathways for students to do that. If you get a chance, look at our course catalog. I would say it's probably one of the most diverse that you'll find, and because we want to meet students where they're at. And that is this, that's part of this process as well as we get into this, prom and celebration season. And I guess I want to try to wrap it up here, but with a useful maybe moment for us to all reflect on something we would give to a parent as a tool, possibly to have these feel better about the decision-making processes of their own teens. And I would say have the tough conversations, as uncomfortable as it is, and as easy as that sounds. I'm a father myself. I get the difficulty. As easy as that sounds, I think it's age-old advice that I think parents have heard for a really long time, and I think there's a reason why we've heard that for a really long time, is to continue to have the conversations. You may not think you're making an impact on your son or daughter, but you really are, and I think we find that in education as we look at it a lot, that we look at giving advice or advising and having these conversations as work such as chopping down a really long tree. It's going to take, it might take a long time. It might take a long time, and we have to be okay with that.
And to you parents out there listening, I would say the school and us in law enforcement, if you're trying to have one of these harder conversations with your kid and you need some preparation for it, our Stop DWI program has tons of pamphlets and information right on our website.
www.stopdwi.org.
Everyone here listening, I'm sure has heard of Google. You can simply Google, all the CDC statistics, Stop DWI programs, research, do some research on your own as everything starts in the home. Prepare yourself for that hard conversation that you may or may not have with your child.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
To along with these consequences and talking, stop DWI, obviously we don't want anyone to be drinking, driving, or impaired driving behind any vehicle, wheel the vehicle while you're under those influences. But I want to stress that sometimes we all make mistakes, right? And I think the conversation along with the parents have to have with these kids is, if you do make that mistake, I'm here for you. Call me. I will come and get you. Don't get behind the wheel of the vehicle. Let them know that you're there. Yep, you can be as mad as you want, but in that moment, you need to be calm, cool, collective, get them safe, and then have that conversation of the huge mistake they made that night by doing what they were doing. But they also need to know that they made the right choice by reaching out to mom or dad or someone who was sober to come and get them home safe, so they didn't take someone else's life or their own by driving impaired. Because I'm sure mom and dad, as mad as they might be that night that you did something they didn't want you to do, would rather have that phone call from you asking for a ride instead of myself or Deputy Mendoza arriving at the door, knocking at 2 o'clock in the morning to say, you're not coming home. So the conversation needs to be had all around. The consequences of impaired driving, the consequences of not reaching out when you need the help to try to fix that situation so you don't make a bad situation worse.
Yeah, and I'm going to piggyback on that a little bit and say the other thing I would suggest as a possibility is practicing what to say or do when you see that something is about to happen or somebody's about to do something that they shouldn't do. You know, if you see somebody has a bottle of liquor in their car and they're going to start drinking it, how are you going to talk to that other person and what are you going to say to them? And literally not just talk about what would be the right thing to say, but actually practice saying it. There's a lot of power in that. And that's something that parents can do with their kids. It's something kids can do with each other too. So I think that's a tip I would pass along.
That's a great point. You know, a student is terrific at the cello because they practice the cello. We would hope our students are terrific at being social beings because they might have to practice being a social being, and I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So I'm very, very hopeful that this was helpful for all of the parents and students out there to maybe hear our perspective on this. Again, it's not always an easy conversation to have, or it doesn't really present itself probably as much as it should. So we wanted to take a moment and share some thoughts and resources from both the law enforcement end, the school end, and we want you to have a great time at these events, but also, you know, again, every day. You're faced with these decisions every day. We understand that. And I'll say this, parents, one last thing. If you do have, if you're finding difficulty in getting into these conversations, our counseling department is awesome and will certainly help you bridge the gap if needed as well. To leave you with that last resource there, I'd like to thank Deputy Mendoza and Deputy Haag for coming in, taking out time. Obviously really important, and we appreciate you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We appreciate being here.
Very much, yeah.
You know, and Mr. Battin, thank you for carving out time today.
A pleasure.
And I appreciate the time. And we, at this point, will sign off. And thank you for your time, everyone. And we are Peru.
You've been listening to the We Are Peru podcast. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you enjoyed listening, please subscribe and share us with your colleagues and friends. And consider leaving us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at ndamianiPCSD and jmitchellPCSD. Thanks again for listening. And remember, we are Peru.